Hello and welcome to the Wire Talks. I'm Sidharth Bhatia. The Punjab government recently shut down internet access throughout the state as its law and order forces chased wanted fugitive Amritpal Singh. Initially, it was for a day or two, but then it kept on getting extended, and it is still in force in some cities and districts. Many Twitter accounts were also withheld by the company on demands by the government. Media bodies around the world criticized the shutdown, which deprived over 27 million people of connectivity. This is a worrying trend. In 2022, authorities around the world shut down the internet 187 times in 35 countries, and India led the list with 84 of them. 49 of them are only in Kashmir. Why does it happen so often, and why does it happen so often in India? Our guest today, Namrata Maheshwari, has studied this phenomenon. She works on issues pertaining to privacy, surveillance, data protection, and internet shutdowns for Access Now, an international organization working on digital rights. Namrata Maheshwari, welcome to the Wire Talks.
Hi, Sidharth. Thank you so much for having me.
Namrata, India is the leading country when it comes to internet shutdown. It's quite a dubious status, wouldn't you say? I was just checking that the other countries are like Myanmar, battling insurgency and so much more, are way, way behind. Why does India, a functioning democracy, do this so regularly?
Absolutely, Siddharth. And as I have said before, this is one title that India as a country should not aim to have and should aim to kind of shrug off as soon as we can. As you mentioned, in 2022, there were 187 shutdowns globally. India imposed 84 of those. And in 2021, there were 106 shutdowns in India alone. And the second country was Myanmar at 15. In 22, the second country is Ukraine. And that I think is telling because there is such a huge margin between India and then the next country that has imposed the highest number of shutdowns, that are going through such instability and crisis. And India has now led the count for 5 years in a row, which is a very alarming trend for the world's largest democracy. It impacts people's rights, it impacts people's livelihoods, and it impacts our economy at large. So I think the problem is in the framework governing shutdowns. We need to undertake a detailed review, enable reform in the legal and regulatory framework that is governing shutdowns. And there is guidance and direction to do this from our Supreme Court, from the Parliament, and from civil society across many quarters. It's just a matter of seeing this action play out.
But then the question arises, why are authorities, there is guidance, perhaps there is somewhere, I'm trying to imagine there is also thinking on those lines, but why are the authorities so quick to switch off the internet?
The trend over the last few years suggests that it is being used as a kind of easy to implement measure, a low hanging fruit. The stated reason often is to control law and order situations, to curb the spread of disinformation or misinformation. But very few orders are actually made public, despite the Supreme Court judgment requiring governments to put these orders out in the public domain so that they can be challenged and reviewed. But even among the reasons that have been stated, the efficacy is questionable. There is no study demonstrating whether these shutdowns are in fact effective. And in fact, the studies that are available suggest the opposite. There is research to show that shutdowns could in fact result in increase in violence and in disinformation or misinformation spreading faster. And there is a logical explanation for this. When you have access to the internet, you have the ability to access multiple sources of information to verify the information and news that you are receiving, as opposed to the limitations that are imposed by this lack of access. It also makes it much harder for fact checkers on the ground to, for example, put out whether something is just fake news or accurate information.
So what you're saying, if I got it right, is that while the authorities are quick to react, and shut down, it doesn't even meet its purpose, stated purpose.
There is no study to suggest that it meets its stated purpose.
Okay, but ask anyone in the government or at any level, and I think the first thing they would say, I'm presuming, is that it stops wild rumors and from spreading fake news, misinformation, and that I think one can correlate because of all these Twitter accounts that have been suspended. So basically, what they are saying is that we don't want the situation, which is already dangerous, to become even more violent. And you are saying that there is nothing to suggest that this could happen.
There is no study, no. I think at the end of the day, whenever there is a law and policy measure that is being imposed that has such a dramatic impact on people's fundamental rights, and that is well established, right? Internet shutdowns affect people's ability to express themselves, to communicate with loved ones, to earn a livelihood, to assemble freely. These are all basic human rights. So there are two things about this claim that you just mentioned are often cited. One is, as I mentioned, logic suggests that this knee-jerk reaction of imposing a shutdown to curb this spread will, if at all, even if it does, hypothetically, have a very short-term it'll be a short-term solution. In the long run, because I have no way of verifying information, and there is no way for fact checkers to put out whether something is accurate in real time, it is going to lead to that disinformation spreading more widely. And second, even if we put the efficacy aspect aside for a second, any such measure has to ultimately be necessary or proportionate, given that it is impacting fundamental rights. And this is something that our Supreme Court has said. This is something that our international human rights framework says. So no matter what the motive, a blanket internet shutdown affecting millions of people and their rights can arguably never be considered necessary or proportionate.
What are the other? You mentioned that it has a wider impact. People can't contact their loved ones in times of difficulty, even personal difficulty, nothing to do with the situation at hand. Somebody needs to be taken to hospital, or it affects livelihoods because of e-commerce, because of what is the wider kind of impact that this has? You keep saying fundamental rights, so it must be more than just mere misinformation. And what is the wider impact?
Sure, let me give you a few examples, right? It affects people's livelihoods. And I think the impact of shutdowns was really made clear because of how much we shifted to the digital space during the pandemic. People rely on it to access education, to obtain healthcare, to stay in touch with their loved ones. And gig workers, for example, there are studies to show that people have lost employment because internet was shut down, payments were not being processed. This is happening, remember, alongside a very aggressive push for digitization. Most of our services are moving online. We have the Digital India mission, the digitized economy goal, but at the same time, we are not addressing problems that are aggravating our digital divide, which includes internet shutdowns. Take, for example, the fact that when these shutdowns happen, it mostly means that mobile internet services are suspended, which means people like you and me who have access to broadband can still access the internet, but people who have to rely only on mobile internet don't have access. It also
Sorry,
increases.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. You'll have to clarify that. Are you saying this affects only mobile telephony and not broadband?
Most of the shutdowns that are imposed involve suspension of mobile internet services and not Wi-Fi and broadband.
So then what's the point, if I may ask?
That exactly is what I mean. It kind of deepens the digital divide, right? What is trying to be controlled here is communication. And most people rely on mobile internet services and telecom service providers to communicate in that manner. But what they don't realize is that people like you and me, like I said, we have access to broadband, we have access to Wi-Fi. So it is disproportionately impacting people who don't have those kind of resources, and who it also kind of deepens the divide between urban and rural localities. There is a huge difference in broadband access depending on where you are. So that is kind of the day-to-day impact. To give you an example from the recent shutdown in Punjab, it affects mobility. We have FASTag, which we need for our electronic toll collection across most national highways. We received reports that these were not working effectively because of suspension of mobile internet services. So people were stuck. Imagine somebody needing to rush to the hospital and being stuck there because a service is not working. So this push for digitization versus the constant rise in internet shutdowns and the inability of people to access this digital space, it affects a range of aspects even in our daily lives.
I come from a very different generation pre-internet. And I was just thinking to myself that suppose in the case of a disturbance or a prolonged disturbance, imagine the government shutting down newspapers. I mean, it would never happen. It would raise such a hue and cry. And what is happening truly, just to control a flow of misinformation, so called, you're shutting down a newspaper, because one can argue that newspapers don't necessarily give fake news, but basically it's really something that people look forward to. I was just thinking aloud that this is preposterous in these times when everybody is relying on knowing what's going on through their phone.
You're absolutely right. And to build on that, if you look at the framework today, there are a lot more safeguards for, let's say, if the government wants to block the publication of a book or wants to block a website. I mean, the content governance framework is wrought with lack of safeguards, but just in terms of the steps involved, for example. But when it comes to shutting down the entire internet, there are no safeguards effectively. So to block a book or to ban publication, there will still have to be an order from a court, a public notice, and a lot of other steps. But to block the internet at large, we are not even seeing often the orders under which this is being done, which means the ability of people to challenge it is circumspect. So that you're right in that it is highly disproportionate. Even the review committees that we do have under the telecom suspension rules, right to information requests suggest that they don't actually review the orders that are passed. None of the timelines in the rules are adhered to. And these are basic safeguards. The rules are not even great in how many safeguards they give us, but even the little ones that are there are not followed at all.
Can you expand on, you said that we don't even know because nobody tells anybody, but what is a nominal process, the process that we know of that the authorities follow in shutting down the internet? And what is the legal framework?
The legal framework on shutdowns right now is mainly two things. One is the telecom suspension rules, which was under the Indian Telegraph Act. These came in 2017. And the other that is still being used, although it should not be, is Section 144 of the Criminal Procedure Code, which empowers magistrates to require some action to be taken if there is a threat to public law and order. Now, when the suspension rules came in 2017, very clearly, Section 144 of CRPC, it should have become obsolete in as far as it was being used to impose shutdowns. But, and this is something that even the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Communications and Information Technology pointed out, they said you are using these dual frameworks. So you have home secretaries and other authorities under the telecom suspension rules imposing shutdowns. And you also have local authorities imposing them under the criminal procedure code. So where is the accountability? Why is there this duality? Where is the database of shutdowns? If somebody wants to check today how many shutdowns have been imposed where, the government has not provided answers. They said we don't have this database. We don't know how many shutdowns were imposed where. So that is the kind of framework and lack of accountability and transparency that we are operating with.
Now, you mentioned governments. State government has done this in Punjab. But really speaking, as I think saw in Rajasthan in a few cases, even a local policeman, police inspector or DCP or SP level person can order it for his district.
That's exactly the problem. That is exactly what should not be happening. Suspension rules are very clear. It has to be the Home Secretary at the state or union level, and the CRPC provision should not be used at all. And even under the suspension rules, even if something has to be done by somebody with less authority for an emergency, that has to be subject to review within 24 hours. The committee has to sit within 5 days. But there is no clarity on whether this is happening. And the few right to information reports that we do have do suggest that this is not happening in the manner that it should be happening. So, like you are saying, the problem, I think, is with the opacity around at different levels of governance, whether it is police officials, state level law enforcement, state level government agencies, or the center itself. There are orders being imposed from multiple directions without accountability from any of them.
So everyone's making merry in this situation, and it's a very worrying situation. We'll finally kind of look at the whole thing all over again towards the end. Now, along with the internet shutdown, which has happened in Punjab, the Punjab government asked for many Twitter accounts to be withheld. These include accounts of local information sites, newspapers, also an MP, a Punjab MP, and a few reasonably known figures, at least one reasonably known figure from Canada, Jagmeet Singh, who's the head of one of the biggest political parties in his country, and they've ensured that his Twitter account cannot be read here. Now, that's pretty wide, a wide spectrum of people whose Twitter accounts have been suspended. Is two questions. One, can they really do this? Two, does Twitter have to comply with this order?
The content governance framework in India right now is essentially Section 69 of the IT Act, which empowers the government to require internet service providers to block content. And then there's also the contentious IT rules of 2021, under which also recently the BBC documentary was blocked. So the government does have extensive powers, again, without adequate limitations, without safeguards, to require blocking of content on social media platforms or websites. Whether Twitter is required to comply with these orders, the way the IT rules work is that these are due diligence requirements. If you don't comply with these orders, then you could potentially have to go to court to argue whether you should be held liable for content posted by third parties, which is essentially safe harbor protection. So due diligence requirements are what you need to comply with in order to have that safe harbor protection. That does not mean that if you choose not to comply, you immediately lose it. It means that there could potentially be a case about this in court. We do believe that Twitter does have a responsibility, or any private company does have the responsibility to push back against orders that could potentially harm. So the short answer is yes, we do have a content governance framework right now that has several gray areas and extensive powers for the government to block content without independent judicial oversight, without adequate notice to the people who are affected. And the second prong of this is that private companies should be pushing back because they have the obligation to do so.
Well, past record, except for one or two instances, is not very encouraging. I think the larger social media companies and others see the big picture as far as they are concerned, and they are very quick to. Doesn't India also have a pretty high up position in shutting down Twitter accounts and Facebook?
It does. It does. There have been several instances of such blocking, especially over the last 2 or 3 years. In fact, I think Software Freedom Law Center in India recently published a report that provides an overview of the number of websites that have been blocked, the number of social media posts that have been blocked over the last 2 or 3 years, and the numbers are staggering. But just to your point on companies pushing back, I think in the recent past, there is some change. WhatsApp has gone to court to challenge the IT rules. So has Facebook. Twitter has gone to court specifically challenging a whole range of blocking orders that they received from the government. So I think we are reaching that inflection point where frameworks are now becoming so compliance heavy and potentially so damaging for rights that we will see courts playing an increasingly important role in how these policies evolve over time.
We'll be right back after this short break. Welcome back to the Wire Talks.
The organization you work for, Access Now, is part of a Keep It On coalition of 105 countries across the world fighting internet shutdown. What exactly does this campaign do? What is it for?
So the Keep It On coalition, anchored by Access Now, works together across regions to push back against shutdowns. Our core position is that we don't think internet shutdowns can ever be justified because they have too dramatic an effect on human rights, on democracy, and on the economy as a whole. So we also recognize that they have negative impact across borders, which is why we are a coalition of organizations coming from different geographies. So we push back against these. We push for accountability, even from the private sector, from telecom service providers, from internet service providers, asking them to push back against these orders, asking them to notify users, to fulfill their obligations on business and human rights. And we push back against problematic policies. For example, the draft telecom bill that came out in India last year, and any law that empowers the governments to impose shutdowns in a way that is completely devoid of safeguards.
Are the governments responding? Have you found any positive response anywhere in the world?
I'd say there are responses also because, for example, the United Nations, a lot of international organizations are bringing a lot of attention to the negative impact of internet shutdowns. It happened in the context of Myanmar, for example. People are also drawing attention to how India has led the count for 5 years in a row. So this global attention, including from the Office of the Human Rights Commissioner at the United Nations. So such attention does eventually trickle down to the domestic level and at least lead to conversations. And we hope that in the long term, that will lead to tangible change as well. Because we are seeing this issue at least coming to the forefront and not just being discussed between a handful of people and quote unquote on the esoteric issue of technology policy and internet governance. So we're seeing that members of parliament and governments and law enforcement agencies around the world are at least willing to engage on the topic, even if we are still on two different ends of the spectrum.
What can citizens do? Because I think this needs to percolate down to even the level of the citizen who perhaps, while suffering the problems of internet shutdowns, as you said, there all kinds of things could happen, but in general, in a conceptual sense, try to understand that it's right now, it's not anything to do, it's not over and above what you do in life, it's a part of your life, that you can't get in touch with people, you can't drive your car through, and you can't buy things, and you can't even buy medicines, perhaps. What kind of campaign has there to be for the citizen to understand that it is now a very, very important, crucial part of their lives?
I think citizens do experience that on a daily basis, actually, Sidharth, because the same things that you mentioned, right? And especially after the pandemic, so many children are still attending school online. And remember, shutdown is not just when internet services are suspended, it is also when they are slowed down to the extent that they are effectively unusable. So if a region has 2G today, that is not good enough. That is effectively unusable. So people do realize how much it affects their lives. The conversation does not always need to happen at the level of the Indian Constitution and fundamental rights. The daily impact of it is people have lived experiences. People are sharing these stories. So many of these are now available. Media is reporting on it, right? Stories from Meghalaya, stories from Kashmir, about people who have lost employment, people who could not get care for COVID patients in time because they were not able to connect with the people that they needed to connect with. So I think people do have that realization. And I also think the environment right now is ripe to push for change because, as I mentioned, we have courts in India demanding accountability from the government. There are cases in high courts and at the Supreme Court against internet shutdowns. And the court has asked the government for answers, saying, is there a protocol? What are the procedures that you are following? And there's, of course, the Namrata Singh judgment from 2020, which said that you need access to the internet to realize your fundamental rights under Article 19 and 21, which is your right to life, liberty, and your right to freedom of expression. It also said that orders have to be made public and that shutdowns can only be imposed if they are necessary and proportionate. And this is where the impunity aspect comes in, right? Despite the Supreme Court having said that in 2020, these things are still not happening. Orders are not being made public. There is no assessment of necessity and proportionality. And it's not just the Supreme Court. Since 2021 of December, we also have pressure from the parliament. There was a report on shutdowns from the standing committee, which said all of these are issues. You have no database. You are following multiple laws to exercise the same powers. And it has a deep impact on people's rights. So what are you doing about it? Here's a set of recommendations. And just to wrap that up, last month, the standing committee also issued an action taken report saying it's been over a year and none of these recommendations have been implemented. And this is highly disappointing. So what I'm trying to say is that there is now a realization on the part of citizenry, even if it's not as wide as we might like it to be. It's happening. We're on the way there. And there is pressure from the other two branches of the government.
And what I was saying was it's worrying. It's definitely very, very worrying. And this, what you've just outlined and mentioned, shows that realization has trickled down to the level of citizens and to lawmakers. But will the governments, will that SP, will that district magistrate, will they still be reaching out for that kill switch? And will the governments really react? Will a situation come when even a government body will think twice, at least think twice before imposing a shutdown? Do you think that is, you mentioned inflection points. Do you think that that's imminent or can happen now soon enough?
I think that is the goal. That is what we aim to achieve. When it will happen, the timeline is for any of us to speculate. But that is the goal. Our goal is for very soon a keep it on report to not have India at the top of the table. Hopefully nowhere, no country should be imposing such a wide scale of shutdowns. But India, as I said, has led for 5 years in a row, and we do hope that it will shed off that title very soon. But I do think that public conversation is happening. It is becoming more a part of public vocabulary. Given the penetration of smartphones, mobile internet, more people are relying on those services for all the things that we have been discussing. And therefore, more people are realizing how essential it is. We have to start thinking of it as essential service. The way we have now come to think of, let's say, electricity and water. And of course, the scales at which these issues operate is different. The real life impact is different. But having said that, in terms of the link to fundamental rights and even just daily conveniences, they are both very, very tangible. So I do think we will get there. The Indian government has the Digital India vision. It also has the G20 presidency this year with tracks on digital economy and digital inclusion. So at some point, this contradiction between this acceleration towards digitization and the aim to be a global leader on these issues and the rampant imposition of shutdowns and how that completely misaligns with this goal is going to become too glaring to ignore. And that, I think, will push us towards greater accountability. And I think for us as people in this country, people affected by these moves, we have to ask these questions. We have to ask why conversations on digital inclusion at the intergovernmental level are not involving questions about internet shutdowns, for example. So I do think we'll get there, even just as a necessary follow-up to the Digital India vision and increased digitization?
Well, we have thinker and advocate on these issues of internet shutdowns being hopeful here. So I think we should follow that example and be hopeful. But on a more serious note, I feel, and I'm fairly confident, that the general perception has trickled down to the level of many citizens, most citizens, in fact, I would say optimistically, that the internet is something that is as vital as electricity. You can't have digitization campaigns and at the same time have internet shutdowns. So one hopes that internet shutdowns will become a thing of the past and not the first action of an administration as seen in Punjab. I think what has happened in Punjab is simply unbelievable in these times, to shut down 27 million people with no access to the internet for 72 hours, and much less for even till for the last 6 days. This is we thank you, Namrata, for being a participant in the Wire Talks and explaining so lucidly what an internet shutdown, what are the implications, and we hope your objectives will be realized very soon. That was Namrata Maheshwari of Access Now talking about the impunity and the excesses of internet shutdowns in India, which has got the dubious distinction of being number one for the past 5 years. We'll be back once again next week with another episode of the Wire Talks. Till then, from me, Sidharth Bhatia, and the rest of the team, goodbye.
You can check out this podcast and other interesting ones on the Wire website, the IVM podcast website, app, or wherever else that you get your podcasts. Goodbye from me, Sidharth Bhatia, and the Wire Talks podcast team.